January, your elders began preaching through a little series to try and articulate some of the defining themes of what we believe Compass Church is. And what I had the opportunity to preach about was on worship and prayer and the importance. And through that whole process, when I kind of got done, it was apparent that I'd stopped for the evening, but the sermon wasn't done. So, sorry, part 2. And we're going to try and not make it part 3, so we're going to get through a lot. But what I want to do is kind of recap just a little bit. We started, I've titled this, Compass Church is an intimate people, and we'll kind of get to that. But we got to the point where we talked about worship and prayer. After we did some study about worship and prayer, we came to the point where we understood that worship and prayer in the church leads us to intimacy with each other. And that's a really good thing. And so I think maybe if I just continued on, that would be my next thought, is Compass Church is an intimate people. Intimate. So let's look again at the definition of intimacy. Infinite intimacy. See, there we go. Brian can cut all that out later. Intimacy defined. A close, familiar, and usually affection or loving personal relationship with another person or group. A close association with or detailed knowledge or deep understanding. So that is kind of the characteristics that define the intimacy. I can have an intimate knowledge of history. I can have an intimate relationship with my children. I can have an intimate relationship with my neighbor. So intimacy comes together to really talk about, it's that knowing relationship with one another. I have seen in my work with a hospice, elderly couples who've been married 60, some of them, I think the longest has been, about 70, 71 years. And it's fascinating to me because I look at them and I recognize the moments when they're just looking at each other without a word passing between them, yet they're communicating on a very deep level because they've spent a lifetime together. That's intimacy. That's the picture of the church, that level of intimacy. So then we talked about 3 things, 3 different types or directions of intimacy. And that first one was internal. It's what we have an intimacy with ourselves. It's the same thing. It's that self-awareness. It's understanding who we are, accepting who we are, being friends with who we are, even though we're in the process of becoming more like Jesus. Then the next direction is the vertical intimacy, and that's our relationship with God. And of course, we want that to be a very intimate relationship where we're gaining more and more knowledge. God already has all the knowledge on His side of it, right? We're the ones trying to catch up. But still, we're growing in that intimate knowledge and understanding and love towards God. Then the next direction is the horizontal. And that's between people. That's where the Bible says, love one another. That's why it says individual, then another. I thought about putting one another in there, but I thought, that's probably taking it too far. And my corny jokes, So let's take a look at a couple Bible verses that we looked at before, just to help define this. In John 15 it says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." And also in 2 Corinthians 13, "Finally, brothers, rejoice, aim for restoration, comfort one another, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you." Doesn't that describe the type of relationship you would like to have with your church family? Folks, if we foster that type of relationship, we will not be able to house people that look and need that type of intimacy. So how do we foster that intimacy? Well, we looked at 6 things here. That first one we've already talked about a little bit, is that deep knowledge. But the next one is deep caring. And that's where we're very into each other, and we're taking care of each other's needs. And we're paying attention enough that oftentimes we'll notice the needs even before they're spoken, because that's the level of intimacy. That's why, the small groups and the small gatherings that we have as a church family is very important, so you can understand the intimacy level on those small group levels to be able to go and meet those needs when they arise. And then the next one is this word that I've used as interdependence. It's not independent where we're all individuals. We are individuals, but this talks about choosing to become interdependent. I see that very plainly in a marriage relationship. The ideal marriage relationship is when we have 2 healthy, fully functioning, single people who are comfortable with themselves and comfortable being by themselves, choosing to come together and then becoming interdependent on each other. And that relationship will blossom into a healthy marriage relationship that is those relationships I described earlier, people who've been married 60 and 70 years that can communicate without saying a word. And D is mutuality, where they're both working in this relationship. And then commitment, and finally, trust. You have to have trust in all your relationships that are working. We can have a relationship with somebody that we're not intimate with. I can walk down the street in Mason and I see somebody, and I'm in a relationship with that person for 10 or 15 seconds as we're walking by, and then that's it. But I was in a relationship with them. I was in proximity. But that doesn't mean I have a commitment or a trust or any of these other things. So what we're doing is attempting to be an intimate congregation, an intimate people of God. Well, then we ask the question, what blows up intimacy? And we use this picture, a World War II, and it shows the destruction of war. And it's not very pretty, and I've simply labeled it sin. When sin comes into a relationship, one or the other or both, the relationship begins to blow up. That intimacy becomes affected. So when we look at these things of deep knowledge and deep caring, interdependence, mutuality, and commitment, those things can all be affected. But the cornerstone of this relationship is trust. And when sin enters in and blows up a relationship, it is trust that is the foundation that everything else is built on. And if this foundation of trust crumbles, everything else begins to crumble as well. So now we have broken trust. Well, many of you are kind of tracking with me and understanding trust. And so I want to continue talking about trust, and we're going to talk about restoring trust once it is broken. But we have to stop and ask a question. Should broken trust always be restored? Broken trust should not always be restored. Not always. And there's some very legitimate reasons. First of all, it's not always wise to restore trust, restore relationship. If the relationship is at risk of ongoing harm, then precautions have to be set up. In reality, there may be some processes that the offending party who's doing the harm can become healthy, and then maybe the relationship can be restored, and that's fine. But oftentimes, when we're talking about sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal, emotional abuse, this ongoing pattern, We can't always restore those relationships. And it's not always possible. Sometimes the person that we have this broken relationship with passes away, and we're never able to come back together, even to attempt to restore it. You know, I think of the example with parents. I've dealt with them in my counseling office, you know, where a child comes in, an adult child, and we're talking about their parents that have been passed away for 10 years, 20 years, or longer. And yet, they have so much grief and frustration and all this because of some problems in the relationship all those years ago. And before it could get resolved, they passed away, and now it's not possible. So that's a possibility. There's also the not always possible because of mental illness. Sometimes people are simply not capable. You know, I think about people who are abusers. Oftentimes there's an underlying mental illness, it's frustration that's going on there. And you know, we try and we get into that, and all of a sudden we figure out, wait a minute, something is really off kilter in this relationship I've been building. Now all of a sudden it's fallen apart. And then as it all unravels, we realize we've been the victim of an abusive person. And because of that mental illness, we can't go back in there and restore that trust. It goes back up to the first one where it says it's not always wise because of the risk of ongoing harm. And the last thing I thought of was sometimes one or even both parties in a relationship are simply not willing to restore the relationship. As I think about this, I want us to broaden the scope of what we're talking. Because so far, we're really talking about individual to individual, but this goes farther than that. Sometimes it goes to, individual to an organization. And specifically for us, I want you to think about these things tonight about, maybe a church. An individual who becomes just, hurt at a church or something's going on, and then they just disappear from the church. And there may be legitimate reasons for doing that, but oftentimes those relationships can be restored. And so we really have to take some good consideration of that. You see, I've noticed a pattern. I don't have any scientific hard facts, and it's more anecdotal. I've been around church for over 30 years, and I've seen a lot of people come into the church and then leave a church. I've seen new believers come in and be so excited and be there for a while, and then all of a sudden something happens and they're gone. I've seen long-time believers who, maybe move, so they've changed a couple churches, and then all of a sudden something happens, and the relationships are broken, and all of a sudden they just disappear, and then we find out they're over at this church or that church. And the pattern that I think I see is a pattern where somebody's in a church congregation and they're active, they're doing what Christ has called us to do, trying to live in community, trying to serve Christ through the church, they're doing the work that we've been called to do, and then in that process, a relationship is hurt. Trust becomes broken. And then that person or that family leaves. But you see, they're smart enough, because they know they're a Christian and they need to go to church. So they don't go over to another church and then dive into that. No, they've kind of been burnt. So they move to a church where they can be more anonymous. Oftentimes those are the larger churches. You can come in 5 minutes late, sit 3 or 4 pews in from the back, and when it's over you can quickly get right back out, and you didn't really have to interact with anybody. But you checked off going to church. And then if there's another hurt, it seems like then those people just simply stop going to church. So it's that process. Now, I'm not saying it always holds true, but I've seen that pattern or something similar to it many times. And I've often wondered when I see those patterns, look, what would happen if those people were able, in a healthy way, to sit down with, the staff or whatever, and in a healthy way, Be able to say, man, what happened? Or, maybe it was, somebody else on one of the teams you were working and there's conflict, and be able to sit down and say, man, what's going on? And be able to work out those differences. Once hurts are overcome and that trust is restored, it is a stronger relationship than the one you had previously with them. You see, when you feel hurt, when you feel trust has been broken, and both parties acknowledge that and say yes, and go through the work of restoring that trust, that's another building block on the trust. Because if hurt happens again, you can trust that person's going to work it out again. So those relationships become stronger. Again, in a marriage relationship, I've seen this happen. I know it's hard to believe, but once in a while, I'm not perfect. It doesn't happen very often, I know. And actually, if you talk to my wife for 5 minutes, you'd still think that I was perfect. But get to that 6 or 7 minute mark and it's all done. And so there's conflict. But when we come together and it's worked out, we're closer for it. Our love is deepened. And that's the picture the church should be. Well, now let's just skim through some chapters of the Bible. I want to give you an illustration with some observations of how we can restore some trust. And this comes from Genesis. And you probably know the story if you've been around any time at all. You've heard of Joseph. We're not going to talk about his multicolored coat, but anyway, that's part of the story. So I'm going to give you an overview because we're not going to look at 6, 7, 8 chapters of the Bible tonight, verse by verse. No amen? Okay, thank you. So let's just kind of set this whole thing up. This whole thing starts with Jacob. Jacob, the name Jacob means supplanter or trickster. I named one of my kids' middle names that, and he's lived up to it. But this trickster goes through life, and he's the second born of twins. His brother Esau, you've probably heard this. Well, basically Jacob tricks Esau into giving the birthright. Well, that made a big hullabaloo. And now all of a sudden, he's pretty sure Esau's going to kill him, so he picks up and he takes off. So he lands with family. And folks, if you have family like this, run the other direction. Just going to say. So he comes up to Laban's place. And he says, hey family, I'm here and I'm going to work and whatever. And of course the Lord's blessing his work and he's doing well. And of course he notices a girl and he likes this girl. It's Laban's daughter. And he says, Laban, he's probably, I wonder if his middle name was Jacob because he's quite the trickster too. But he comes up and he says, oh, you want to marry her? All right. Rachel, yeah. Well, you worked for me for 7 years. You can have her as a wife. All right, he says, and he works. Comes to the wedding. They come with the veils and everything else, and it's the evening, and they'd go through the whole wedding ceremony, and I can just imagine Jacob is excited. It's a wonderful thing. And now it's time for the wedding night, and away they go. It's back then, it's night, they're in a tent, they didn't have lights, Modesty probably played in there, those early times of marriage, and, lights are down low or off, and so it's dark, and they enjoy their marital relationship and fall asleep, and pretty soon they're waking up to the chirping birds, and I can imagine, Jacob's heart's just a pounding. He's got the girl of his dreams. He's worked 7 years, and he kind of turns over, and the light is kind of coming in there, and he goes, "Hey, you're not Rachel. You're Leah." He got tricked into marrying the wrong sister. So he goes to his father-in-law and says, "What's this?" He says, "Well, hey, I couldn't give you the younger one until the older one was married, so you got her. I'll give you the younger one too, though, but you got to work for another 7 years." Okay. So he goes through and he does this. Another 7 years. Now he's got 2 wives. Now, friends, I've never understood. I can't keep up with one. I don't get this. But anyway, that's the Bible story. And so it comes along, and these girls, that's the big thing, is they want to produce offspring. Well, it's not happening. So the handmaidens come into play. And all of a sudden the handmaidens are producing children. Well, then the girls start producing children. But it was Leah first. And quite a few. And Rachel was still barren. And very late in life, she finally gives birth to Jacob. Now, Rachel was the favorite. Gives birth to a boy, Jacob. Joseph, sorry. And so it's all good. He becomes his father's favorite. Well, then a little while later, along comes a little brother, Benjamin. But in labor, the mom dies. Rachel dies. The favorite wife with these 2 sons who were the favorites. Mom's gone. Sadness. What's left? These handmaidens? You already kicked them out. But the woman he got tricked into marrying. So here's this situation. The favorite, second to youngest. Thing is, he was smart and he was good. So he's kind of daddy's right-hand man to all of his older brothers. So they're out doing their sheep thing, and he says, "Hey, go check on them." And he goes over there. "Hey, Dad, they're not doing what they're supposed to do." He's a tattletale. Can you imagine? That doesn't sit too well with these older brothers. Now, I never had a younger brother. I did have a younger sister, which I don't know if it could be any worse. So this is the picture. And all of a sudden these older brothers, they start thinking, we got to get rid of this kid. And then, these dreams Joseph is having, and he's basically telling them they're all going to bow down to him. And that says, now we really got to get rid of him. We're going to kill him. Well, one of the brothers sticks up and says, no, let's just put him in a well. And the plan was he's going to come and rescue him later and he'd be okay. But in the meantime, this caravan came through. They had another idea. Well, let's not kill him. Let's make some money off him. They sell their little brother into slavery. That's why we let the younger kids go in the other room so they didn't hear that to get up any ideas. Sells their little brother into slavery. And away he goes. They tell Dad he got eaten by a lion. They even had that multicolored coat. Put blood on it. And here's all ripped up. Dad's, he's hurting. But they got rid of the little problem. So off to Egypt he goes. Well, pretty soon he finds himself in the service of Potiphar. And you know that part of the story too. He gets falsely accused and put into prison. And while he's in prison, pretty soon he's in charge of the prison. That's kind of weird. But anyway. And the prison just goes great. It's smooth administration. Pretty soon he's interpreting dreams. There's the royal cupbearer and the royal baker come in. They're both in trouble. One of them's a traitor, and they don't know which one, but Pharaoh throws them both in there. They have a dream, and Joseph interprets a dream, saying one of you is going to die and this one's going to be restored. And sure enough, it came to pass. But then the one who survived, he forgot to tell Pharaoh about Joseph. So Joseph's still in prison until Pharaoh comes up with his own dream. And nobody could interpret it. And all of a sudden, oh yeah, there's this guy I met in prison. He was pretty good at this. Let's go get him. So sure enough, Joseph comes out, explains the dream. 7 years of famine are going to come. So they have to prepare. Pharaoh, in his infinite wisdom, decides to put Joseph in charge of stockpiling all the food they're going to need for these 7 years. So now Joseph is second in charge to Egypt, the most powerful country in the world at that time. Joseph is in charge. Sure enough, famine hits. Now where his father and his brothers and all their families are, they're starving too. But they hear about the grain in Egypt. And so the brothers take off and show up in Egypt, looking for food. They're going to buy it. No problem. Make sure I don't get ahead of myself. So they show up in chapter 42. All the brothers except the youngest one, Benjamin, Daddy's favorite, the last born, the youngest, stays behind because Dad couldn't take it if something happened to him. So these brothers show up. They meet Joseph because they have to do business with him. Joseph recognizes them immediately. Now they don't recognize him. He's all Egyptianized. And he pretends he doesn't understand their language. They have an interpreter. So they're off there, talk. And he's just listening. He knows exactly what's going on. Haven't you ever want to do that? You see people that you can't speak their language, they're over there. Are they talking about me? I'd love to be able to know what's really being said. But Joseph, when he starts with them, the first thing is he speaks roughly to them. He says, the Bible says, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly with them. So when we're restoring broken trust, the first slide there in this section, it talks about a guarded interaction. And when trust has been broken, we're hurting, right? And we're not sure we can trust that person anymore. And so when we do start to interact again, we're very guarded. We're going to make sure. We don't come in like this. We're more like this. And that's perfectly normal and wise in those relationships. And so that's exactly what Joseph did. In Genesis 42:7, he spoke roughly to them. Well, the story goes on, and they're saying, well, we've got money, we're going to do this, and he's asking more questions. Well, pretty soon he's accusing them of being spies. He knows they're not spies, but he's accusing them. And he says, no, we're not. And he says, well, what about your father? Well, our father still lives. What about, is this all the brothers? No, we have a younger one. So he gets all the information out of them that they were trying to hold back to protect this younger brother. And so Joseph, he comes down to him and he says, all right, here's what you're going to do. Send one of you and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested. So now, what he's trying to do is make sure there's some congruency between the words and actions. And when restoring relationships, this is part of what we're doing. Now, Joseph is kind of setting up the test. That's normally not what we do. That's more manipulation in the real world here, what we do. I suppose I can see some things, obviously, where it would be beneficial to do it that way, but that's not interpersonal relationships. We don't set somebody else up to fail to see if the relationship's going to work. It's not fair, it's not right, it's manipulative. But this is what's going on. He's trying to check out the congruency with the words and actions. And that is what we do. We listen to the words that are being said. There's all kinds of promises that are going to be made, or agreements that are going to be made when we're restoring relationships with this other person. We want to make sure that the actions are going to live out what the words and promises are. And as we get that right, it starts to rebuild that trust. So they come up with this whole scheme. Instead of everybody staying, just one did. Nice negotiation going on there, right? So Joseph, he ties up his brother, Simeon. And Simeon was the nice one, if you can say any of them are nice, that throw him into a well. But anyway, so he stays there. Everybody else takes off. Well, interestingly, all the bags that were filled with the grain they needed to be able to feed the families, they all found that the money they had paid, all their bags of coins and money had been put back into the top of these sacks. So they're now probably, I don't know, was it a few days down the road or something, and almost home, or anyway, they're down the road a ways, and they want to get some of it out to feed the animals, and they notice, oh no, here's all of our money. What in the world's happened? I mean, that's like going to the store and you buying all your groceries, and you come home and you find out all the cash you gave to pay for those groceries is back in your bag. How did that happen? You're going, I just stole it. I didn't mean to. Did I? Didn't I give that money to them? Can you imagine that, uncomfortable feeling? So they get back, and now they're home, and they're talking, and all this is going on. And they realize they've got to go back, because that was the promise. They've got to take their little brother back. And if they don't get their older brother back. So they finally convinced Dad, let us take him. Dad didn't want to let him go. He's the favorite son, the youngest, the only surviving son of his favorite wife. He didn't want to let him go. Finally, he relented. But he gave them some really good advice. In chapter 43, he says, take some of the choice fruits of the land in your bags and carry a present down to the man, meaning Joseph. A little balm, a little honey, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. And take double the money. When you're restoring relationships, you're trying to learn to be more thoughtful. And you're going to demonstrate your thoughtfulness in whatever ways that work in that relationship. And that's exactly what it says here, because they carry this present off to Joseph. So now they're taking off, and they're all together. They got double the money, the presents and everything. They arrive in Egypt, and the people there say, hey, you're going right over to Joseph's house. Of course, he's got some Egyptian name now that I can't pronounce. So they think, uh-oh, now we're going to his house? He still thinks we're spies. He's going to get us over there to his house, and he's going to kill us all. That's what they're worried about. And so when they get over to the house, they walk up there, and they're remembering the problem with the money. And so they go right up to the steward of the house. He says, hey, look, we don't know what happened, but when we were heading back, all the money was put back in our bags. Now, look, we brought that money back to give to you. We weren't trying to steal. I mean, that's the essence. Not only that, we have double the money. We're trying to show our integrity. But what that is a picture of in restoring relationships and restoring trust is transparency. You see, when trust has been broken, anything that appears to be hidden, anything that appears to be secretive, simply fuels the distrust. And so we have to come forward with transparency. When I've worked with couples who've had maybe pornography problems in the relationship or infidelity in the relationship and such, this is one of the biggest and first things we have to establish is this absolute transparency, because without that component, the likelihood of that relationship going further or being restored is slim. So transparency. That's exactly what they exhibited here, was transparency. So anyway, they're reassured everything's okay. We come down to chapter 44, and Joseph is testing the brothers again. He packs them up with some more stuff. Joseph have his servants, the Egyptians, put the money back into the bags again. But not only that, the silver cup. But they put it in the youngest son's bag, little Benjamin. And away they go. Well, he lets them get so far away. Then they take off after him. And, the sirens are going. It's that blue and red light in the rearview mirror. They pull over the caravan, come up, knock on the window. You all stole from me. No, we didn't. We didn't do anything. Swear to God. Well, then we'll search your bags. Fine, you search. And if it's in anybody's bag, you can kill them. Guess whose it's in? The favorite son. So he knows. Joseph's brothers know, if this is the issue, and they're going to kill the youngest son, it's going to kill their dad. So this is a big deal. So now these guys, they get back to Joseph's place, and they're all together. And one of the brothers, he comes up, and he's whispering Joseph's ear, and he says, God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also is in whose hand the cup has been found. The thing was, he was not confessing about a stolen cup. He was confessing the lifelong, the years, it was about 13 years or so, of the guilt that these brothers were experiencing because they sold Joseph off into slavery. Their guilt was coming out. So I think their idea was, God's punishing us for all this other bad stuff. We didn't do what you're accusing us, but we certainly did the other thing. So confession. And that's what has to happen. And you're restoring a broken, trusted relationship. There's got to be confession. You've got to come forward and be able to say, yes, I did it. I didn't mean to, or yes, I meant to, or boy, I handled that bad, or whatever it is. But the confession's got to be there. Accepting the responsibility. And that's exactly what these brothers were doing. So Joseph gets the story. As we further down this chapter, we get the situation where he's telling the whole story about the only way they got the little brother to come along was assuring Dad that he was going to be safe. And so this brother is saying, look, if I don't bring him back to my father, then he says, to my father, I said, then I shall bear the blame before all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord. He's asking to take his little brother's place. And what Joseph sees here is something that is important if we're trying to rebuild these relationships. It's a demonstration of change. You see, these guys were so self-centered, they sold their little brother off into slavery. And now here we are, 6 or 7 chapters later, and they're saying, look, I want to sacrifice myself for my brother's life. Beginning of chapter 45, it says, then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He's in his home. All of his servants are there. All of his brothers are there. And he's choking up because he realizes the whole process, the whole transformation has taken place. And so then he reveals himself once all of his servants are gone. And of course, they haven't seen Joseph in a long time. I imagine he's matured and like I said, he's all Egyptianized, and they don't believe it. And finally he says, yes. Well, then they believe it. But now they're afraid. But Joseph does something different. We get to verse 5. And it says, as he's talking to his brothers, now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. Sounds like forgiveness to me. Now the forgiveness did not come first. The forgiveness was given only after he saw everything else we've talked about. He might have purposed in his heart that he would be able to forgive his brothers. But this is a point where it was heartfelt. This was the restoration of the family. Do not be distressed. But then he goes on a little bit farther, and this is important too. He demonstrates that he has a different perspective on the problem. In verse 7 he says of chapter 45, and God sent me before you to preserve you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. He had God's perspective. Joseph had God's perspective in restoring a relationship with his brothers. When we're in relationship with one another, having God's perspective, the eternal perspective, the God's worldview, the Christian worldview's perspective on relationship can help us have the courage to work through the process of rebuilding trust and restoring relationships. Well, he goes on and he says, all right, you're going to go get the rest of your families. Dad, your wives, kids, servants, get them all. I'm sending wagons and away you're going to go. And he does exactly that. But just before they leave, it says in verse 24 of 45, then he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, do not quarrel on the way. I thought that was interesting. What would they be quarreling about? All I can just hear as soon as they got out of earshot. I told you not to put him that well. I told you, it's all your fault. They're going to start blaming each other. That sounds an awful lot like rumination to me. Where we go back and we just play things over and over and over and over in our head negatively. And we have to avoid that to have a healthy, trust-restored relationship. Look, you and I are not God. We're not going to choose to forget the hurts. Okay? But it doesn't mean we have to dwell on them. And so those are some of the steps that are pointed out here. I'm not saying that's the ABC method of restoring relationships, but this is a pretty good pattern. Every relationship that becomes broken has its own path, its own parts that have to occur. But this covers a lot of them. So what do we do, though, when that work of restoring trust is really too fearful? What if we take a look at this relationship and we think, boy, that hurt is so bad. I don't know if I can trust again. How do we go forward? This person that I'm in this relationship has broken trust with me over and over again. And now the relationship's at zero. How do I restore it? And if you make the choice to do that, if it's one of the relationships that can be. If it's not one of the relationships like we talked about earlier as we began this journey, that's really not salvageable in normal circumstances, then we come back to this point, that it's God. You see, God is the anchor of our trust. God is faithful. He is sovereign. He is loving. He is wise. See, we don't have to take that person's trust. We take God's. You see, when our trust is anchored in God, then it gives us the freedom to allow somebody else to rebuild the trust relationship with me. Because whatever that person does, I have God's trust as my anchor. In Philippians 1:6 it says, "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." That's a promise of God. Isn't that wonderful to think about? The work that God started in me, He's promised He's going to bring that to completion. Doesn't that make us feel secure? This wasn't written just to you. It was also written to the person you're trying to build that relationship, restore that relationship. God, who began the relationship, God, who began the work in this person that's now hurt you, God is still working in that person, and we can have faith that God will bring that to completion. I want to read you this quote from Josh Squires. It says, "Our hope, our trust, and our faith do not find their strength or confidence in the actions of a fellow sinner, but in the steadfast love of a sinless Savior. There and there alone we will find a well of trust that never runs dry and never betrays." That's our God. And you remember that picture at the beginning of the war zone? That was in 1944, and that's 2005. And that's just a symbol of what God can do in restoring relationships if we'll put the work into them. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your love. I thank you that we can trust you. I thank you that there's never been a promise that you have ever made that has ever been broken. And it never will. It is so absolutely outside your character to break a promise that if you did, you would cease to be God in that moment, that instant. And that's not possible either. So, Father, as I look to the people to my right and my left, in front of me and behind me, and all of those that are in relation, understanding, Lord, that the life we lead in this sin-fallen world will bring hurts. So, Father, I pray that you'll help me to be healthy, that I might be able to restore healthy relationships with those people that I break trust with, or who break trust with me. So, Father, in your sovereignty, I am secure. In you, I'm faith.
Just go into the regular thing.
So, Lord, I just pray that you would bless these thoughts and continue, Lord, to give us your wisdom, ever greater, that we can do relationships and be the church of intimacy that you have designed us to be. So we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.